Story number one. Ibadan, Nigeria, is a city that houses many tales, some whispered between friends late at night, others lost under the heavy ceilings of the forest that stretches just outside the city's reach. That forest, known locally as the Ibadan Forest of Horror, is a name that churns up a slurry of rumor and dread. Until recently, I didn't believe half of what I'd heard. But then my friend disappeared. He was a taxi driver driving deep into the city's remote places, trusted by neighbors and strangers alike. In the 2 weeks since I'd known him, he had often spoken fondly of trees, how they made him feel at peace. Solitude, he said, came easily to those who listened to the trees breathing. On the 7th day of his absence, his wife called me, her voice wavering between panic and exhaustion. He hadn't come home, hadn't been seen after his last fare, drove him somewhere near the forest's edge. It was a Wednesday. I remember because the air was thick with humidity, and the world seemed to sweat beneath the cloudy sky. Alongside a ragtag group of friends and volunteers, I set out into the deep woods of the Ibadan. The forest greeted us with the buzzing of insects, the crunching of leaves, and an oppressive silence that seemed to hover just at the threshold of our senses. After hours weaving under ancient trees, our group thinned out, each of us branching into separate trails in hopes of covering more ground. Alone, I found my courage thinning, but I pressed forward, sweeping my flashlight in wide, clumsy arcs. Then quite suddenly, something tore the silence. A scream, familiar, yet warped by the dampening effect of moss and distance. I spun, the sound pinballing between trunks and canopy, impossible to trace. My breath quickened until each inhale tasted sharp and metallic. I felt eyes on me, the prickling weight of a gaze from above. I peered into the canopy, catching glimpses of shadows shivering between leaves, but nothing solid presented itself. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something had retreated out of sight just as I looked. That's when I noticed the structure, a silhouette against the bruised sky, obscured by vines and branches. Its skin was cracked, faded, some relic of colonial ambition, maybe an old school or manufacturing plant. The air near it was different, charged as though it were a mouth exhaling old secrets. Despite the gnawing in my gut, I stepped toward it. Survival instinct screamed at me to turn back, but the thin hope that my friend might be inside held me steady. The main door was split and lopsided on its hinges. As I entered, a cold current of air pressed against my back, and the door groaned shut behind me. It slammed with such force I wondered if wind alone could have managed it. Night was swallowing the remnants of daylight, so I flicked on my phone's flashlight. The beam wandered over peeling walls, catching veins of mold and graffiti etched in strange looping characters. My voice wobbled as I called out, only to ricochet back from empty rooms, doubled and somehow corrupted by the echo. A narrow corridor led me to a door beneath a stairwell. Rust crusted the old padlock, but the metal had long ago surrendered its function. As I brushed past, a whisper curled at my ear. Cool, breathy, not quite language, but not quite wind either. My muscles seized, each hair on my arm stood tight as strings. I whipped around, nothing. And then suddenly a tug at my leg, like a child grasping for attention. I froze, then stumbled forward as if nudged. My foot found a slope I hadn't noticed, and I tumbled down, scraping elbows and knuckles as I slid into darkness. I landed before a door, slick and sticky with what looked, in the pale spill of moonlight through a broken window, worryingly like dried blood. My scream fractured the silence, but the building ate the sound. I mustered trembling limbs to push the door open. The hinges shrieked, a sound that vibrated uncomfortably in my chest. The room beyond was a vision of nightmarish disorder. Chains snaked across the stained tiles, old ropes coiled in corners, and the air stunk of rot. Colors smeared beneath the dying light where blood had pooled years before. But the worst was ahead. A cage, no, several, crammed in the corner. 8 people or more, hunched, gaunt as skeletons adorned in clinging rags. Their eyes, sunk into black-rimmed sockets, fixed on me with a blend of hope and terror. Some moaned softly, others babbled in a language unlike anything I'd heard, sharp and guttural. The word Satan drifted toward me, recognizable even in the incomprehensible babble. A darkness flickered in the adjacent hallway. Not a body or animal, but a blot of swarming blackness, gliding at the edge of vision. The mass seemed to breathe. It recoiled at my stare, like a shadow drawing in on itself, utterly silent, except for the pounding of my own heart. When I moved closer to the cage, the survivors recoiled, cramming themselves into corners, praying or chanting in that strange tongue. Light from my phone revealed scattered objects, a singed wallet, a cracked watch, a woman's battered sandal, personal artifacts mired in filth. My foot struck something. I looked down at a human head, eyes wide and glassy, its hair matted with dried gore. The The moon painted twin glimpses in its pupils, making them look almost alive. Around it, more fractured bodies, flesh hanging loose from bones like rags. The stench slid invisibly into my nose, gagging me. From somewhere above, a cacophony of voices suddenly erupted, my friends finally tracing my path. Relief diluted the panic, and I shouted back. As they helped break the captive's shackles, I frantically searched among the survivors. None of them resembled my friend. The authorities arrived, but the perpetrators were never found. In the following months, some of the rescued people grew a private language, complex, unknowable, spoken in quick, furtive bursts. They seemed not to recall its meaning or how they'd learned it. Each participant was swallowed by their own trauma, eyes hollow, ribs like lattices beneath skin. My friend's fate remains untraced. No body, no sign, just rumors, faces in the dark, and the haunted silence of the forest that still waits beyond Ibadan. At night, especially in the lull before sleep, I see flickering shapes at the ceiling and remember the shadow slipping through that ruin. Maybe the forest simply bred cruelty and madness, or maybe something older squatted in those trees. What happened could be explained by human evil, by isolation, and fear preying upon the mind. But no one can explain the whispers that sometimes tickle my ear in the quiet, or the language that emerges from my dreams, jagged and urgent. I am left only with questions and the sense that whatever hides in the Ibadan forest is not finished. Not yet. Story number 2. This is something that still puzzles me, and it's been almost 3 years since it happened. I remember because the memory crawls back up my spine at odd moments, usually at night, familiar as the humming of an old fridge in a dark kitchen. It was around 3 a.m. My job, janitorial, had me on nighttime rotation. Nothing new. Dead hour, some people call that time, though I find it's just quieter, the world emptied of momentum. That night, driving back home on the old two-lane county road, I caught sight of a house I was certain I'd never seen before. It perched atop a knoll, awkwardly close to the road, looming out of the trees in a way that made my headlights bounce weirdly off its windows. An old house, too big, too many peaks and gables, with paint flaking away in curls and black gaps where glass should have been. It looked haunted, and if it weren't so absurd, I might say it looked expectant. And for some reason, I stopped. Some pull, a kind of breathless urge, drew me in. Key in my pocket, flashlight in hand, I stepped out of my car into the hush. The gravel made no sound under my feet. Only later did I register how that isn't normal. The porch steps creaked under my weight, but nothing else moved. Not even wind through the trees. Only the distant hum of my engine cooling. I remember pushing open the door, not locked, swollen wood dragging across warped floorboards. My light caught dust swirling in the stale air. As I moved inside, I noticed the strangest details. Pale pink wallpaper peeling in solid strips. An old clock with no hands. Triple shadows thrown against the high walls despite my single flashlight. My footsteps echoed in places where, by any logic, they shouldn't have. There was a smell like faded roses gone bad, mold sweetening at the edges. Instinctively, I drifted toward a set of stairs. They were grand, swirling up to the second floor. The banister was carved ornately, thorns and vines snaking along the rail, ebonized and glinting even in my weak light. I moved up, footsteps measured, but the echo always a half step behind. From somewhere above came the almost sound of stifled laughter, like breath against glass. At the top, I saw her. She was standing at the curve of the landing, a woman, maybe 20 at most, her short dark hair perfectly still, as if underwater. She wore a long white wedding dress, puddled in quicksilver folds at her feet. Her eyes were fixed somewhere behind me, lips slack. It was so unnaturally silent, I felt the pressure build, so I tried, stupidly, to call out. Before a word left me, a scream exploded into my right ear, close, like someone shrieked with their mouth pressed to my skin. Every hair on my body prickled, a cold current rippling up and down. I whipped around, nothing. Back at the landing, the woman was gone, just empty, warped floor. I managed a laugh, a brittle high sound, convincing myself my nerves were fried. Maybe a trick of exhaustion. Still, curiosity pulled me down the hall. I started checking rooms, each emptier than the next. The only light was what my beam provided, except for a faint flicker from beneath a door at the end of the hallway. The rest of the house, clearly disconnected, was entombed in dark. I pushed open the door. Grime-covered wallpaper peeled from the walls. A broken crib sat in the corner, half shrouded by moth-eaten lace. The cold hit me, sharp, unnatural, not just the absence of warmth, but as if I'd walked straight into winter. My breath showed in thin clouds. My bones ached with the temperature. Suddenly, a tap on my shoulder, light, insistent, the way a child would do it. I spun but saw only a doll on the ground, a few feet from the door. It had rolled into place, almost staged, pressed up against the wall. It wore a ruined white dress, streaked with dulled red. The face was porcelain, eerily detailed. The same dark hair, the same dress as the woman I'd seen, but its throat was marked by a jagged gash, bright paint bleeding made to look like flowing blood, staining its chest and pooling at its skirt's hem. My skin crawled. I backed away, but again, that tap, firmer, braver. In the shifting light, the room lengthened, corners stretching impossibly far. From the shadow by the window, the same woman stepped forward, her face twisted, a void where her eyes should have been, mouth dropped open, that same torn wound trailing rivulets over bone-white dress. Her head rolled unnaturally over her shoulder, cracking as it shifted. For a moment, the scene glitched. Her form flickered, the doll and her overlaid, a messy double exposure. My panic blossomed slowly, leaden, as if my limbs moved underwater. I tried to run, feet heavy. As I spun for the door, her voice, softer than silk, thinner than a whisper, trickled behind me, telling me not to leave, that she had waited so long. The voice was different now, almost pleasant. I turned. She stood there, looking ordinary, beautiful even, her hair glossy, her skin shining with the health of youth. Her voice grew clearer, telling me stories. She said she'd waited for me, that long ago she had died, and so had I, and she had lingered, yearning for our reunion. Her tale spilled out, strange and fragmented, a wedding never finished, a love cut off by death, her loneliness staining the years. She said she'd kept the house empty for me, chasing away others, holding on in hope. Even though I didn't recognize her, her words pressed close, touching something deep in me, a memory or something like it, insistent but unreachable. I wanted to speak, to protest, but my throat stopped, pinched by invisible hands. My chest crushed in, air freezing at my lips. Paralyzed, I could do nothing but listen and nod, as though underwater. She stepped closer and placed a knife, heavy, old, rusted, into my hand. Standing over the banister, every part of me said to run, but her presence overwhelmed all thought. She told me, if I joined her, ended it as she had, we could move on together forever. Soon it felt like the right thing, maybe the only thing. I pressed the blade to my throat, balancing on the precipice, then snapped awake, coughing myself into consciousness, sheets plastered to my skin with cold sweat. The room was grainy with early dawn, but on the floor beside my bed lay an old kitchen knife. I don't remember bringing it there, and I never saw one like it in my kitchen. To this day, I puzzle over it. Had I sleepwalked? The knife was just that, a night terror's leftover? Sometimes I search for that house along that stretch of road, but every time, all I see is forest and the curve of gravel. Nothing more. Sometimes, though, in the mirror, I see someone besides myself behind my eyes. That story, whatever it was, refuses to let go, and I can never quite convince myself it was all just a dream. Story number 3. When I was 12, I experienced something I have never told anyone in full detail, not even my mother. When people talk about childhood fears, locked rooms, or footsteps at night, I stay quiet, because there are things that, retrospectively, seem impossible, yet I lived through them. My mother had to leave town unexpectedly for a family matter. It was only for a couple of days, so she trusted me to stay by myself. Our neighborhood was safe, relatives were a street away, and I had my dog Pepper for company. Still, there is a difference between being alone in the afternoon and being alone at midnight. We lived in a 2-story house on the outskirts of the city, where the streetlights cast more shadow than light, and every sound bounced off the chipped walls with extra weight. The landline phone sat in the living room like a museum piece, and my mother scoffed at the idea of me needing a mobile. She said she'd call if anything came up, and that I should expect her back on Sunday. She left on a Thursday. At first, it felt adventurous, almost fun. Order pizza, leave the television on, let Pepper sleep in my bed. The first night, just past midnight, I woke to the sharp crash of plates shattering downstairs. I jolted up, heart in my throat, a cold sweat beating my forehead. Pepper, my brick-colored mutt, was sleeping curled at my feet. The door was locked from inside. How could she be both with me and in the kitchen at the same time? I listened, tension coiling through my body, but after a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was the old kitchen shelf flexing under the cold. The next morning, every piece of crockery was in its place. No mess, no broken porcelain. I could still hear the shiver in my bones from the sound, though. On the second night, I felt eyes on me. It started as a tickle of paranoia while brushing my teeth, like someone watching in the half-open bathroom mirror. As I tried to focus on my book, the sensation grew. Pepper whimpered quietly and glued herself to my side, her tail curled under her body. I pushed the feeling away, blaming my imagination. Then as I was drifting off, footsteps tapped briskly across the hallway. They were too quick to be my mother's, too light to be an adult, and too deliberate to be an animal. Something darted past the sliver of light under my door, pressing a moving shadow against the sill before vanishing. Pepper growled, low and trembling. Pressed against her side, I listened as the footsteps faded, then returned. A strange, looping rhythm, like pacing. I tried to rationalize. Restless, I wandered the house the next day, searching for a logical explanation. All the windows were locked. The attic and basement were empty save for boxes and the persistent, faint smell of mildew. I barely ate. Every time Pepper left my line of sight, I panicked on some animal level, certain she or I wouldn't be returning. On Saturday, restless and sleepless, I spent most of the day on the couch, television flickering but unwatched. As darkness pooled in the corners of the living room, the air felt dense, colder than before. That night, I locked my door, tucked the sheets tight, left the lamp on. Even Pepper, normally bold, refused to leave the circle of light. Then Sunday came, the day my mother was to return. Relief coursed through me like medicine as the clock crept past 6. I retreated to my room, unable to shake the feeling that I was being followed by something patient and unseen, something content to wait. At dusk, I heard the front gate swing open. A heavy fist pounded at the door, harsh and insistent. Through the crack in my window, I heard my mother's voice, calling my name, but muffled as if spoken through a mouthful of earth. Not at all like the bright, clipped tones I remembered. Pepper perked up, then bolted toward the stairs, tail wagging in a fit of excitement. I felt briefly reassured. Dogs know their own people. But halfway down the stairs, she froze. Her ears flattened, her tail dropped, and she let out a yelp that scraped through the empty house. She stumbled back up the stairs, whimpering, as if whatever was on the other side of the door burned her eyes. I had never seen Pepper afraid of my mother. Panting, Pepper pressed herself against my legs as I walked to the stairs. The knocking had grown desperate, the voice angrier and ragged, almost scraping the door with every syllable. Sweat stung my eyes and my stomach knotted. I told myself this was simply my mother, angry to be left outside. Maybe she had a cold. Maybe she was frustrated. Maybe. Just as I reached for the knob, the shrill ring of the landline sliced through the house, sharp, urgent, heart-stopping. The knocking stopped on the instant, like someone had frozen mid-strike. I hesitated, then rushed to the phone, hoping to stanch the tremor in my hands by doing something normal. It was my mother's voice, relaxed, even a little tired. She told me her train had been delayed. She wouldn't be home until Monday afternoon instead. She sounded disappointed, apologetic, not at all like whoever had been outside just seconds ago. My skin prickled, my mind spinning as I tried to find sense in whatever had happened. Maybe she had called from the porch. Maybe there was a time delay in the lines. Maybe I'd heard a neighbor or someone who sounded eerily like her. But when I returned to the front door, the porch was empty. The evening air carried no hint of footsteps, no sign that anyone had been there. Pepper refused to go near it the rest of the night. The next morning crawled by with leaded hours, each shadow hitting harder than the last. When my mother finally arrived the following day, she carried the same bags, wore the same coat, and hugged me with the same arms that had tucked me into bed every night for years. Her perfume was familiar, and she laughed when Pepper finally let herself be calmed, although Pepper's tail lilted hesitantly rather than wagging with joy. Yet there were small things, her voice a half step deeper, her gait a touch too silent. She looked at me at dinner for a patronizing second longer than she used to, and when she smiled, I wondered if her teeth were too straight, or just if I had never noticed. In the years since, I've told myself that grief and loneliness do strange things to the brain, that children stuck alone can create terrors out of dust and dusk, that dogs panic over the scent of a stray cat or a thunderstorm forming miles away. But I still can't be alone, not for long. I still flinch at heavy knocking, at any voice calling my name from the street. For all the logic in the world, I will always wonder, what would have happened if I had opened the door? And in the quiet, just before sleep, I sometimes feel the circle of light pressed close, and something patient still waiting, still watching, just beyond the threshold. Story number 4. I was 15, and although I'm 25 now, those memories run under my skin even today. My mother and I had run all the way across the country to this battered women's shelter in a corner of Washington, hiding from my father, who had both the law and malevolence on his side. The shelter was a chopped-up old Victorian, paint peeling, windows foggy, with too many rooms and too many doors. Sacramento rain always seemed to cling to the place, and the building reeked of mildew and old angry tears. Every corner turned wrong in that house at night. Even my mother, resolute and practical, always seemed taut and sleep-starved. I'd whisper my fears to her, but she would press my shoulder and shush me, eyes focused as if she was asking me not to notice secrets she herself was trying to ignore. None of us had our own bathrooms. Ours was a shared, barely lit cubicle down a twisting corridor. The first incident happened maybe 3 weeks after we arrived, after midnight. The other children slept bundled with their mothers, thin bodies and forlorn faces. But I was restless. The world outside our quilt was dangerous, but inside the shelter air felt charged with something I couldn't name. The fluorescent hall lights buzzed overhead, white moths hurling themselves silently against the fixtures. That night I slipped out to use the bathroom, shuffling in thick socks, feet cold against creaky floorboards. I tried not to look at the walls, half-patched wallpaper and strange stains, and kept my head down. As I walked, I heard someone behind me, soft but unmistakable footsteps at first. I glanced back, and the corridor yawned empty. Assuming it was my mind, I pushed forward. The next moment, the footsteps returned, firmer and now accompanied by a dragging, scraping noise, like a heavy tool being pulled across the boards. My heart jumped in my chest and sweat prickled my back. I wanted to turn, but my head was locked forward, eyes only searching for the battered bathroom door. The sound followed me, not racing, just steady, as if whoever was behind me knew I had nowhere else to go. When I finally slipped into the bathroom, the dreadful sensation ebbed, replaced by the familiar sharp stink of disinfectant. I stood at the basin, breathing hard, the mirror fogged from someone else's earlier shower. I splashed cold water on my face. When I looked up, my vision swam, the fluorescent lights above flickering. Instead of my reflection, something else was there. It stood, a shape clothed in tangled, curling black hair, hunched and broad-shouldered, its face as if sculpted out of nightmares, teeth too long beneath staring, unblinking eyes. I could see my own jaw trembling inside its shape, as if it had borrowed my fear for a moment. I screamed so hard the sound didn't come out at first, and backed away, feeling the cold porcelain behind me. The fluorescent light above snapped on, and suddenly it was my face again, just pale and wide-eyed and alone. I scrambled out into the corridor, pausing only to listen. There it was again, footsteps echoing around the next corner, the lurking off-sync sound of someone dragging something metal and heavy. My legs took over, rushing me straight back to our little room. My mother, groggy, scolded me gently until I spilled everything in a rush. She forced herself to the bathroom with me, making me stand at the mirror until my own face calmed me. She told me I'd been dreaming or hallucinating from fear and exhaustion and tucked me back in. The shelter was safe, she insisted, but sleep stayed away. I remembered lying there, blanket pulled up to my face, eyes stinging, and then I wasn't alone. At the foot of my bed, in the fuzz of the sodium glow from the street, a man appeared. He stood upright. His face was gentle, almost apologetic, in bland, neutral clothes. He didn't move or say anything, but he stayed there, a shadow formed by anxiety and streetlight, silent through the night. I told myself it was a trick of light. When dawn split the sky, he was gone. The next night, he came again. He was there every night, sometimes a yard off, sometimes closer, never touching, always silently watching over me like a mournful sentinel. I convinced myself he was some fabrication of a desperate brain, an imaginary friend conjured by a child who needed to feel safe. My mother never mentioned him, but the shelter itself never rested. In the day, corridors churned with arguments and crying, workers coming and going, faces always too pale and tired. At night, it sank into something deeper, doors that seemed to close themselves, whispers from the vents, the far-off sound of weeping even when no one was awake. One night, after 4 months, my protector was gone. I noticed his absence straight away, a chill replacing the odd comfort he'd carried. Darkness folded around me, and I woke gasping, certain that something was wrong even before I opened my eyes. The hairy demon stood in my room again, doubled in the shimmer of half-forgotten nightmares, holding something jagged, a rusted axe, its blade chewed by time. It did not lurch or drool or scream. It stared at me in a way that made my limbs turn brittle. For a second, I thought I saw the reflection of the corridor behind it, as if it had torn a hole through the wall. The next instant, it rushed towards me, faster than it should have moved, but just barely within the speed of normal motion, all hair and shadow and heavy breath. I closed my eyes so tight that pain sang behind them, waiting for the impact. When I could breathe again and dared to look, nothing was there. My room was silent and empty. I lay gasping, afraid to move. But then the door creaked open, just a sliver, as though someone wanted to peek but couldn't decide whether to come in. No one appeared. With trembling hands, I pushed the door closed, peered once into the corridor. That's when I saw him, my silent guardian, out there, holding the axe, his stance at odds with his previously kind face. His back turned to me, unmoving, poised in the center of that endless hallway. Panic took me. I locked the door, slid down it, rocked myself until exhaustion stole me away. Morning arrived with my mother's urgent knocking. She told me to pack, said we were leaving, no further explanation. As we hurried out, I saw one of the workers, a man who never met our eyes, watching me from the far end of the yard. Something in his stare made my blood run colder than the night before. We loaded our things, and when my mother opened the trunk, there it was, a battered old axe, stained with what looked for all the world like dark brown rust. She went pale, shoved it out onto the gravel. We never spoke of any of it again. To this day, I wonder, was it trauma, mold poisoning, tricks of dubious lighting? Or was the shelter itself feeding off its old wounds, its corridors too twisted to keep anything safe? There are nights sometimes when I wake blink-eyed in my adult bedroom and imagine a careful face standing in the shadows, or something far larger, hair coiling over the floor, waiting for my eyes to close again. I still don't know which explanation I fear more. Story number 5. I lived in that old Toronto walk-up 4 years ago, but the memories settle on my chest like dirty water from a damp basement, never really evaporating. Mike and I signed the lease mostly out of necessity. Mike was my classmate. Neither of us could afford anything newer on our own. The apartment had its quirks, but for the money, it was almost generous. 2 bedrooms, a window that actually opened, a bath that filled slow but steady. I let the peeling wallpaper and creaking stairs count as character. Maybe I was desperate, or maybe just eager to be done with the search. The first time Mike brought up the banging, I brushed it off. He told me, eyes circled with sleep, that I'd been pacing in the hallway between our rooms all night and pounding on the shared wall like I was trapped. I hesitated for a second, wondering if I'd walked in my sleep or if he was messing with me, but I knew I'd hardly stirred. We agreed it was probably sounds from neighboring apartments or pipes knocking in the skeleton of the old building. That's what you say in aging rentals, always pipes, never ghosts. If I'm honest, the way he'd said it bothered me, but we left it at that. It came up a week later and again after. Some nights it was thudding, muffled by drywall. Sometimes the footsteps raced from his room to mine and back again, so sharp and direct that I'd grip my sheets, waiting for an explanation that never walked through my door. I only ever heard faint echoes, enough to convince myself I dreamed it, or that the weary building was just settling more than usual. The apartment was full of sounds, groans of wood shifting, radiators hissing, the upstairs neighbor dropping heavy things at odd hours. I told myself it was nothing. I had to. The smell started one night in March. It was a heavy smeared scent, cheap floral perfume that clung to the air like sweat. Underneath, a wet, earthy smell, like someone had not so much washed as tried to cover up decades of mildew. It was the kind of odor you almost taste before you realize it's there. I tried cleaning. I'd air the place out, shuffle around with a burning candle, buy room sprays from the shoppers down the street. But nothing worked. Sometimes it vanished for days, but then would roll in again, always with a pulse-lifting sense that something was about to happen. I'd be reading in bed and suddenly feel a spike of dread, like a warning, and only then would the scent creep in, faint at first, then choking. It was about then that I noticed old laundry in the basement. I only went down there to feed Mike's miserable rescue cat. One evening, stepping around the half-empty litter box, I stumbled on a pile of clothes sitting in a damp slab of concrete. A woolen coat, some heavy stockings, and a faded slip. The coat's shoulders sagged with rot, and though I'd never seen anyone wear anything like it, right down to the yellowed buttons and lace trim, part of me wondered if it belonged to the landlord or someone who'd moved out without bothering to claim it. But then I remembered, I'd just noticed it. How could it have sat there for months without catching my eye or gaining a mention from Mike? There was no explanation, so I looked away, blaming the poor lighting and my own inattention, telling myself I'd drop them in the trash after work. Things escalated after Mike left. He did it with barely any warning, one morning shoving boxes into his car as if moving through molasses. I asked if it was about the noises. He shook his head, barely making eye contact, and said he just had to go. I inherited the utility bills and cat. I told myself it was for the best. I could finally have some peace. But the silence was not comforting. It had a tensile edge, like the quiet you hear just before a window breaks or a tap releases a sudden gush of water. The footsteps sounded heavier now, sometimes starting up just as I flicked off the hallway light and went to bed. A few nights I swore I heard coughing, the scratchy, phlegmy, wet kind, close to my door, and once trailing away into the kitchen. Out of some twisted curiosity or maybe desperation, I tried sleeping in Mike's former room. The night was cold and still. The only sound was the wind threading through the gaps in the window frame. At some point I must have fallen asleep. What followed was not sleep. It was a nightmare so vivid I woke gasping. I recall standing in the bathroom, lit by a gray, sickly hue, holding a jagged shard of mirror. My own face stared back, blank and unfamiliar, as my hand rose and pressed the glass into my cheek, drawing slow, deliberate lines. The blood was warm and slick, trailing down my chin. Just as I pressed harder, the vibration of my phone beside me ripped me awake. An early text from my father, just checking in. I was coated in sweat, my heart throbbing with panic. Sleep became broken after that. Reality and dreams melted together. More than once around 2 a.m., a banging would start in the wall again, followed by faint water sounds, the flush of the toilet or the hiss of hot water as the faucet in the bathtub twisted itself on full blast. At first I'd leap from bed, expecting to catch a prankster neighbor or maybe a leak, but every time I crept to the bathroom, the pipes would fall silent before I entered, or the scalding water simply ran unchecked into the drain. Nothing as mundane as a broken handle or a careless hand. I kept trying to make sense of everything. Maybe the old plumbing system was faulty. Maybe someone else's garbage clogged the pipes, triggering odd noises. Maybe stress from work and losing Mike was playing tricks on my mind, twisting sounds and smells into monsters. But the explanation for the TV was harder to find. On a night I remember for its heavy rain, I woke abruptly to the blare of static and the high, shrill music of a horror film. City TV, always running movies late, and this time, the screen glared with ghostly bodies. Poltergeist. The TV in the living room was analog, the kind with bulky dials. To turn it on, you had to yank the clunky knob. I'd always switched it off firmly before bed and never left the power bar on. Yet here it was, on full volume, flickering blue across the empty room. I tried to picture a power surge or a cat brush pawing the controls, but the knob was stiff, too high for the cat, and besides, in the weeks after, this never happened again. Each incident, creepy on its own, was enough to scare the shit out of someone. Together, they built up, layer by clinging layer, until the apartment felt dense with unseen watching. In those last weeks before I moved out, every moment in that place was taut with dread, as if something waited, just out of sight, for a moment of weakness. I'll never know if it was all in my head or if traces of previous tenants, resentful, lonely, or worse, could linger, seeping through the walls, the pipes, the television static. Even now, sometimes, a cheap perfume smell will catch my nose on the street, or an old building's plumbing will hiss, and I'll feel that same prickle at the back of my neck. I tell myself the city is full of old echoes, and that's all it ever was. But late at night, when something bangs in the pipes or I catch the sound of footsteps, I think of the Toronto apartment, and the feeling doesn't quite leave. Story number 6. For months, the kitchen never kept its shape. My name is Sarah, and I had recently moved into a new house with my husband after we had been saving money to get a bigger house. The house was old with wooden furnishings and rusted metal knobs on the door. In those early weeks after the move, boxes still colonized the spare room, and our routines lingered on the edge of unfamiliarity. Morning after morning, I would shuffle in barefoot, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and always find the chairs not pushed in properly, but splayed out in a ring with their spindly legs almost touching, as if poised for some private gathering I hadn't hosted. Sometimes the ring was tight and symmetrical. Other times the chairs teetered at odd angles. It was the kind of thing easy to dismiss. I supposed my partner must have left them that way, or maybe I did, sleep-addled in the hush before dawn. But then came the mornings when the tabletop seemed to bristle with quiet accusation. The salt and pepper shakers, glass heavy-bottomed, perched in narrow swaying towers, the salt balanced on the pepper on a spoon, the spoon on a sugar jar. Spoons themselves started to appear suspended, their handles twisted into the light fixture's chain, metal bowls dangling like odd glinting fruit. The first time it happened, I reached up warily and gently shook the light, expecting the spoons to tumble, but each clung fast as if grown there. My partner, bleary and logical, chalked it up to some midnight habit of mine, or said maybe it was a prank, a joke half remembered from their own sleep. I stopped finding it funny when I noticed the fruit. One morning, Apples that had been sitting bright and unblemished in the wooden bowl now lay strewn around the house. One under a couch cushion, one inside the laundry hamper, another incongruously in the bathtub. Each bore jagged black marks, skins split in deep gouges so that brown rot puffed through as if forced by invisible claws. The fruit, untouched the night before, was ravaged as if with knives. The air in the kitchen grew colder, sometimes carrying the faint smell of iron and wet earth. There were other mornings when the bread in its wrapper oozed greenish mush, and slices that had gone brittle and off as if a month had passed overnight. Milk and eggs spoiled faster than we could consume them, leaving a slick, sour scent clinging to the fridge. Sometimes the cabinet doors yawned open in the stillness, cups stacked in wrong order or appearing in places we never put them. Our sleep became shallow, restless, and hung with expectation. It was the suggestion that I might be sleepwalking, that perhaps I had always done this, that finally prompted the camera. I bought it on a tired afternoon at the hardware store and pointed it squarely at the kitchen table, feeling foolish and oddly exposed. The first few nights it caught only the ordinary: shadows, muffled footsteps, the slow change of light through the windows. On the fourth night, I sat at our battered kitchen table, scrolling through the gray footage, when I noticed the timestamp flickering. Just past 3 in the morning, the feed stuttered, glitched, then went black. It did this every night, regular as the tick of a clock. 3:04 a.m., the camera cut out, and every morning after, the chairs ringed the table once again. On the 6th night, when footage returned, it sputtered back with a blocky, speckled image. There, beneath the table, a shape was hunched in the darkness. A bald, featureless head bent nearly to the ground, shoulders narrowing to a ridgeline. No face, no body, almost misted at the edges. The thing crouched impossibly low, seeming more smudge than person. It didn't move, but the grain of the footage pulsed as if the room itself breathed around it. I rewound, paused, played. The figure was there only for a few seconds, so faint it might have been an artifact of the video, or poor light, or my exhausted brain. Convinced of some malfunction or prank, I set new passwords on the camera, moved the table closer to the wall, even placed the heavy fruit bowl atop the chairs, trying to anchor them. The next morning, the bowl had skittered to the floor, apples torn and crushed, their insides black and slick, with trails of powdered salt sprinkled around them in thin, careful arcs. A spoon was balanced between 2 upturned cups, quivering in the faint draft, and there, almost stamped into the dust, were marks on the floor. Scrapes shaped like loops and jagged crosses, impossible to mistake for the scuff of chair legs. I tried everything after that. I read about cleansing rituals online, watched videos of people burning sage, muttering prayers. The acrid smoke curled in uneasy skeins around the ceiling light, catching on the notes of something sickly in the air. The house felt thick, swollen with a sense of waiting, so I called the local priest, his reassurance measured, brows knit in worry. He visited, splashed the doorway with holy water, blessed the rooms, but afterward, I found the marks grew sharper, almost as if rebelling at each attempt. By this point, every night was another rehearsal of dread. When my partner stayed up with me, we huddled in silence in the murky hours past midnight, waiting. The house settled with unnatural patience, each creak more like a warning. Then near 3, a groan rose up from somewhere deep under the floorboards, a guttural, bone-chilling tremor, neither voice nor plumbing, more like the house's own breath expelling cold and rot. The table vibrated, all 4 chairs wrenched out at once, scraping in abrupt unison. Even the candle flame on the counter bent away, guttered feebly, as if afraid. After that, something settled into the wood and air. One morning I bent to sweep up the grains of salt, and beneath the layer of dust under the table, a sigil had been gouged into the soft wood. Spirals intersecting with jagged lines, their edges black with char. At first I thought it was mold or rot, but the pattern was too deliberate even to blame on us, and too deep for casual scraping. Our nerves stretched thin, routines frayed to nothing. We left, unable to sleep beneath that ceiling a moment longer. The new apartment was on the far end of town, bright and open, but for weeks afterward, I found rings of salt stacked carefully around my bed, as if someone or something still circled, watching from a distance. Whenever I spoke about those months to the few people who'd listen, their explanations trod the same path. Maybe I had night terrors or an undiagnosed sleep disorder. It was just stress, moving anxiety, creaking pipes, or drafty walls warping under the change of seasons. The old house was settling, or maybe mice had gotten into the floorboards, dislodging things with their scurrying. Even the footage could be a trick of the camera, I was told. Heat warping the image, or lens flare, or the shudder of clouded eyes at 3 in the morning. But some nights, as I drift into uneasy sleep, I see it again. The circle of chairs, the fruit dark and caving, the groan beneath the floor. I try to believe the easy explanations, to force myself to say I know the difference between what's real and what's not. But in the hour before dawn, when the silence closes in, I sometimes wonder if something followed us, if somewhere, just out of reach, the ring is forming once more. Story number 7. I took the temp job at the Kingsley packaging plant in November, after 2 months of scraping by on odd gigs and ramen noodles. The money was decent for a graveyard cleaning shift, just 5 nights, solo, inside a place everyone else seemed eager to forget. The site supervisor handed me loose keys on my first evening and said the worst thing would be the old industrial dust. I remember thinking, if anything, this would let my mind rest. Hard labor, friendly to headphones and podcasts, a small break from reality. The first night it smelled of wet cardboard and oil, sharp even through the paper mask. The ceiling felt too high, lights spaced just enough to leave pockets of darkness stretching up like wells. My boots startled, echoing off the concrete as I passed, but I don't spook easy. I set up my cart by the main conveyor, found a rhythm, and let minutes pass in that heavy factory hush. About 40 minutes in, there were footsteps echoing somewhere above, measured, slow, far too steady for creaking beams or the whine of old metal. I stood, mop paused, telling myself it was some security guard doing rounds, but the pattern didn't stop. It moved, a heel-on-floor thump, growing sharper and pausing directly overhead. That's when it started, a deafening series of bangs on metal just above, so hard I felt the vibrations in my jaw. I thumbed the radio to call security, but got shrieking static, and then nothing. My phone, fully charged before, now glowed a flickering red, battery at 13%, sinking so fast I cursed out loud. I pocketed it quickly, blaming cold or the wrong charger, even as I turned my headphones off and listened to the building breathe. By the 4th night, odd routines had started to shift. My work cart, never heavy, kept rolling, just inching when I wasn't looking. I'd uncork a bottle, turn to grab rags, and the cart would be a foot farther down the aisle. It never made a sound, no scraping or rolling. Always, it just wasn't where I'd left it. Some nights, I'd catch up and swear the metal felt cold, slick with condensation, especially on the handle. I chalked it up to slanted floors, drafts, or even the old building groaning under its age. The offices were worse. Power had been cut almost a decade ago, but one night as I dragged mop water up old tile, a voice crackled over the loudspeaker. The speakers were so rusted the announcement came out warped, like something underwater. A single phrase over and over, "Time's up! Time's up!" I waited, mop halfway in the bucket, staring upward as the voice faded, then cut out abruptly. My toes tingled, and I told myself squatters had found the junction box, even as I knew the breaker panels off the main were padlocked and filmed in grime. Windows lined every room off the main floor. In daylight, perhaps they'd let in gold light, but at night, they pressed their faces against me, showing only my reflection and the vague industrial skeleton of wire and shadow. More than once, when I wiped them, I caught shapes beside my own, just after the glass cleared, the outline of 2 people, tall, male by the shoulders, silhouettes lost in old blue workwear. Every time I blinked, they vanished, leaving only the blank panic that hangs between sleep and wake. Twice I returned to my locker to find dark blue jumpers, too heavy, folded on the bench. Each time I picked them up, expecting dry dust, but my hands came away clammy, as if from cold fog or old river water. They held a smell, sharp and metallic, not like sweat, but like something left to rot in wet iron. There were no name tags or patches, just blank navy cloth, a size or two too large for me, sticky with fridge-cold damp. Co-workers, just 2 other temps switching shifts, shrugged at my stories. Stress, they said. Factory buildings like Kingsley always settled strangely. There'd been noise complaints for years before the shutdown. Cleaning shifts always played tricks on the mind. One said teens like to break in, drink, and dare each other up to the highest catwalks. Maybe there were squatters hiding in the walls, pushing carts as a joke, dressing up in old uniforms left behind. I agreed, not trusting myself to argue. Then came the badge. I kept my security badge clipped to my jeans or hung by my locker. On day 11, it vanished. I searched my routes for an hour, convinced it snagged on a doorknob or dropped by the offices. 3 days later, on the start of my shift, it reappeared, clipped to the 3rd floor break room's door, a room still padlocked and sealed, with a lock missing its key since 1998. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. I tried to reason it out, thinking maybe the other staffer had found it, or maintenance had tried the knob. Still, nobody owned up to it, and the guard on duty swore he hadn't been up there in months, not since his knee surgery. The last week, the building's air changed, thickening with each shift. I'd pass storage rooms and feel gusts of freezer burn air, smelling of plastic wrap and something not quite sweet, not quite dead. One night in the locker room, I pulled off my gloves and saw fine black residue on the fingertips, like ash. My hands tingled until morning. Small things piled up. Doors that had been left ajar locked themselves. My phone's flashlight flickered and died as soon as I aimed it at certain corners, especially the old machine shop, where workers supposedly used to eat lunch among the wine of packaging machines. Once I entered a room I swore I'd already mopped, only to find my own muddy footprints tracing back toward the door, as if I'd walked from the far corner while I wasn't looking. No one else saw the reflected shapes or touched the damp uniforms, not that I could prove. The bangs and crackling PA never repeated with witnesses. In daylight, sometimes I drove past Kingsley just to convince myself it was only a sinking, empty shell. A rational part of me choked on explanations. Faulty wiring sparked the loudspeaker. Rodents or drafts nudged the cart. Blue jumpsuits hidden in supply closets retained water from a burst pipe. As for the badge, maybe I'd misplaced it, sleep-deprived and frazzled. But even now, months out, I remember the heavy drag in my chest, the oily chill on my skin, the momentary certainty that I was not alone, that someone or something watched in those glass reflections, waiting for me to look away. I finished the month, locked the last door, and never went back. I tell myself it was just a bad run of insomnia, nerves, and long shadows. Most nights it works. Some nights, though, I wake and think I hear footsteps on the floor above, or catch a flash of navy in my own reflection as I pass. Quick and silent, just out of frame.